A film adaptation of Anne Rice's novel Interview with the Vampire had been in the works ever since the book was published back in 1976, but the project spent the best part of 2 decades in development hell. The film would eventually arrive on the big screen on November 11th, 1994. Although it was released to mixed reviews, it became one of the defining films of the mid-90s because it pitted the 2 biggest film stars of the 90s against each other, Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. The film was released to a flurry of bad publicity. The author of the novel and co-writer of the film script, Anne Rice, had made it perfectly clear that she did not want Tom Cruise to play her hero, Lestat. She saw him as too vanilla to play the decadent vampire. It's a major taboo in Hollywood for a writer, actor or director to say they didn't want a particular star to appear in their film, especially in the build-up to the film's release, because it guarantees bad publicity. News editors are going to pick up on that and mention it whenever the film is referenced in the media. But Anne Rice just didn't care. She was a very wealthy lady, so maybe she felt more at liberty to speak her mind. But this really became the story in the build-up to the film's release. Tom Cruise was, of course, the biggest film star in the world in 1994, and so this is what everybody was talking about. Anne Rice rejects Tom Cruise. However, about a month before the film was released, Anne Rice saw the final cut of it at a private screening and she was blown away by Tom Cruise's performance. She realized she'd been mistaken, and so she took to the airwaves to apologize profusely for rejecting her star. So before we proceed with all the gossip from the making of the film and its aftermath, and believe me, there's plenty of that, we need to take a step back and look at how Anne Rice reinvented the vampire legend for a new generation.
I've been asked that question so many times, why I wrote the book or how I got interested in a vampire or what. I have no answer. I was sitting at the typewriter one night and I wrote the line, "Shall we hold the interview here?" said the vampire. And I started off just writing a short story about what would happen if a boy from an FM radio station found a vampire who would really tell him the whole story of his life. I wrote that short story, I think, in 1969. Or even before, maybe 68. And I kept it for years. I kept dragging it out and going over it. And then it developed into the novel. I mean, there was no more thought really going on in my mind than that. Like, let's just try this experiment, or this would be an interesting thing to do.
Anne Rice was born into an Irish Catholic family in New Orleans in 1941. Both the city of New Orleans and Catholicism would shape her literary imagination. In 1961, Anne married her high school sweetheart, Stan Rice, and here you can see them both in their younger years, and yes, they were a very attractive couple. Stan and Anne moved to San Francisco the following year, and yes, you may have noticed that their first names rhyme. And here's some shaky camera phone footage of the house where Stan and Anne lived in San Francisco. Many years later, she took a photographer to San Fran and pointed out the house. While she was filming this video, she also pointed out that the rent in those days was dirt cheap. Yeah, just amazing, isn't it, to think that a struggling writer could move to a place like San Francisco or New York and live in a nice house like that and pay dirt cheap rent. Imagine trying to do that now. I don't think so. Anne did her undergraduate degree at San Francisco State University. She studied political science, but deep down she really wanted to be a writer, and so when she graduated, she returned to do an MA in creative writing. If you know anything about Anne Rice's biography, you will probably know that her first child, a daughter named Michelle, died at the age of 5 from leukemia. This became the central tragedy in Anne's life, and it would shape her first novel. Michelle had been diagnosed while Anne was studying her MA, so Anne found herself struggling to find a literary voice and trying to care for a sick child. And as she said in this later interview, she would eventually find a literary voice when she turned her attention to the supernatural.
Something about the fantasy framework, the alternative reality, really freed me up to talk about the pain I was feeling. I wasn't getting anywhere with pedestrian realism, trying to talk about it. Writing a realistic story about a mother who lost her child just wasn't going to cut it. But when I went into that alternative reality, in which vampires existed and vampires could talk, somehow I was able to deal with everything I was feeling and had ever felt. And I don't know why that is. I mean, this differs so much with writers. It's almost like something you're given, not something you choose, to write in a historical framework, to write about fantasy characters, to write horror novels. You draw those cards, really. And I had to discover that that's where my real talent lay, was writing about the supernatural. And I just know I was liberated.
It felt freeing. It felt safe.
It was like stepping through a door and saying, well, I can do it in this book. People will understand, you know?
Anne Rice channeled her pain into her debut novel, Interview with the Vampire. So, to summarise, if you've read the book, seen the film, or you're just dimly aware of the story, she set the story up like this. Louis, the vampire narrating the story, is essentially her, racked with Catholic guilt. Lestat, the dashing vampire, is based on her dashing husband, Stan, the poet. And the vampire Claudia is, of course, based on the child she lost. And so this strange family dynamic that you observe in the movie between the vampires Louis and Lestat and the daughter that they adopt and turn into a vampire essentially replicates Anne Rice's own family and the tragedy that nearly tore it apart. There hadn't really been a significant vampire novel published in America since Richard Matheson's I Am Legend in 1954, but then in 1975 Stephen King published his second novel, Salem's Lot, and that book certainly brought vampires back into public consciousness in America, and that was the time that Anne Rice signed her first book deal, which made her a millionaire overnight. Anne Rice is credited with modernizing the vampire myth in her novels, but Stephen King had got there like 1 year before her. Her book was published in 1976, but nonetheless she gets the credit for a reason, because she did come to dominate the genre of vampire fiction, and she really reshaped it, and the early reviews of Interview with the Vampire pick up on that, the sense that Anne Rice had done something different. I'll read a short extract from this early review. The author has tried to do something new, to take the vampire tale and look at it from another angle. Her vampire is not the half-seen figure of terror, but the protagonist. This early review identifies Anne Rice's key contribution to the vampire myth. She makes the vampire the hero, the protagonist of her story. But if you read Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, it's a very different experience, because the Count, Dracula, remains a shadowy figure throughout. He's described by other characters in the form of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. Interview with the Vampire is told from the perspective of Louis in the form of an interview with a radio host. I guess if it was written today, Louis might have become a YouTuber or launched his own podcast or something. Anyhow, the point being, he's giving an interview, so he's describing it from his perspective, and he is a strangely sympathetic character because he's full of doubt. Louis is engaged in a futile struggle to cling on to what remains of his humanity. It's a futile struggle because he's a vampire, so his humanity is long gone. He wants to kill people, but he feels bad about doing so because he has a conscience. Anne Rice further updated the vampire myth by bringing the vampires to America. Just as Bram Stoker brought Count Dracula from Transylvania to Victorian London, Anne Rice gave the vampires a 20th century update by bringing them from Europe to America. Most of Interview with the Vampire is set in New Orleans. Anne Rice also brought the vampire's latent bisexuality to the surface. The sexual ambiguity of vampires had been hinted at in the past, but Anne Rice didn't hint. She made it really, really explicit. Her novels are very gay. I know Gen Z are all about lived experience, but Anne Rice, a heterosexual married woman, found her voice writing about homosexual activities among male vampires. So yeah, make of that what you will. So, in short, Anne Rice made her vampires the protagonists, she made them sympathetic, she made them really gay, and she brought them to America. The formula worked. Her books sold millions of copies all over the world. And let's not forget, in the 1980s, the goth scene really got underway, becoming one of the most enduring subcultures of them all. Anne Rice's vampire novels just so happened to fit in with that scene perfectly. It's really quite surprising that a film version of Interview with the Vampire hadn't been made at some point in the late 70s or in the 1980s. Anne Rice had sold the rights to Paramount for $250,000, which was not a bad deal for an unknown author to get in 1976. Various writers tried their luck with the script, including Anne Rice herself, but the project seemed to haunt Paramount Studios throughout the 1980s. It just never really got anywhere. In this 1988 interview with the Miami Herald, Anne Rice pointed out that the queer aspects of the story may have been a turn-off for the powers that be in Hollywood. And this is the point at which Cher enters the chat. In the Miami Herald interview, Anne Rice had this to say: "I'd be very happy if Cher played Louis as a transvestite woman. I'm serious. Nobody in Hollywood is going to make a love story about two men. I've already been told that. So what I came up with is a solution that struck me as plausible. Louis is me, so in the screen treatment, I made Louis a woman. The woman I'd like to be, you know, a 6-foot-tall transvestite." Well, I mean, it could have happened. Cher has cited Interview with the Vampire as one of her favourite books on numerous occasions, and she made this video right here for We All Sleep Alone around about the time Anne Rice gave that interview, and yeah, Cher looks pretty vampiric in this video. When the film was eventually made with Brad Pitt and not Cher playing the role of Louis, Cher was nonetheless invited to contribute a song to the soundtrack, and so she wrote a song called Lovers Forever. For some reason it was rejected. Now I can't say what the original recording sounded like because it hasn't leaked online yet, but Cher was clearly fond of the song because in 2013 she re-recorded it for her Closer to the Truth album. On that record, it takes on the distinctly EDM tones that were really popular at that time. So yeah, her contribution to Interview with the Vampire lingers on. I would say listen to Closer to the Truth. It's a pretty good album, and that song is a standout. It's very, very camp. And on the topic of songs inspired by the book, as a quick aside, I should point out that Sting wrote a song based on Interview with the Vampire on his first solo album, Moon Over Bourbon Street. I know Sting divides opinion, but that is actually a really good song, so yeah, check it out, add it to your playlists. So, let's fast forward. Things finally got going for the film when David Geffen came on board. He is probably the most powerful man in the entertainment industry. According to Forbes, he is currently worth $8.7 billion. That's even more than Oprah. The arrival of David Geffen also continues the Cher connection, because in the 1970s, David Geffen dated Cher as she was trying to escape from her marriage to Sonny. After his relationship with Cher, David Geffen avoided the spotlight. He also came out as gay, but dating Cher was probably the gayest thing he ever did. David Geffen encouraged Anne Rice to take the lead and write the script herself. This was an unusual move. After all, writing a novel and writing a script for a film are two very different disciplines. Novelists usually get pushed to one side once Hollywood has bought the film rights. It doesn't appear that David Geffen or the bosses at Paramount were entirely satisfied with Anne Rice's script, and so they brought director and screenwriter Neil Jordan on board. Anne Rice, very picky about her collaborators, was nonetheless happy to work with Neil Jordan. He was riding high in Hollywood, having just directed The Crying Game, and in 1984 he directed an adaptation of Angela Carter's short story, The Company of Wolves. The Angela Carter connection would have been appealing to Anne Rice. Like Rice, Carter was a master or mistress of gothic fiction.
A young girl feels her soul awaken to the call of emotions she cannot name. This is the Twilight world, where half-forgotten memories of childhood lead into a fantastic realm.
Neil Jordan set to work refining Anne Rice's script, Paramount were happy with the results, and finally the project had some momentum behind it. It looks like the first actor to sign up was Brad Pitt. Although Brad Pitt would end the 90s pretty much as famous as Tom Cruise, in 1994 he was very much on the cusp of superstardom. His shirtless scene in Thelma and Louise had provoked cardiac arrest in many cinemagoers. River Phoenix was lined up to play Daniel Malloy. He's the reporter who interviews the vampire, but his sudden death from a drug overdose at the Viper Room put an end to that. Casting directors from Paramount found themselves frantically scrambling around looking for somebody to replace him. Christian Slater came on board to replace River Phoenix, but he felt guilty about taking the dead actor's role, and so he donated his fee for the film to charity, which was a nice gesture. I mean, I'd have probably just kept the money. The most important casting decision was, of course, Lestat, who would play the decadent vampire. Anne Rice had her own ideas. She wanted Rutger Hauer of Blade Runner fame for the role. She also considered Jeremy Irons, but both of those actors were getting a little bit old. Lestat was about 21 when he was turned into a vampire, and so although he's around about 200 years old, he, looks younger. Besides, even if Jeremy Irons had been younger, he probably looked about 40 on the day he was born, so yeah, that just would not have worked. Quite out of the blue, another name was thrown into the mix: Tom Cruise. Anne Rice was horrified, but director Neil Jordan thought it was a brilliant casting choice. Of course, it would have helped having the biggest film star in the world in your movie, much easier to market it, etc., and you're pretty much guaranteed to make a profit, but Neil Jordan saw something else in Tom Cruise, more than just money. He saw something, well, vampiric.
Now, Tom Cruise at the time was the biggest star in the world, I've always admired him as an actor, I'd seen him in Born on the 4th of July, I'd seen him in things, and I always thought there's something really interesting in this guy. And when they recommended that I meet him to play this character, Lestat, I was kind of shocked, because he's half the size as the characters I described. He's quite small. And I went to meet him, and there was a chilly thing there, There was a chilling kind of concentration there that was extraordinary, I thought, And there was also the fact that his life, being a huge star, and having to keep his privacy so kind of insanely intact, there was almost a vampiric thing about that. Do you understand what I mean? So I saw somebody like him in a state of extreme vulnerability, actually, and having to prove himself.
Prior to Interview with the Vampire, Tom Cruise had played mostly gung-ho, all-American roles in films like Top Gun and Born on the 4th of July. He often had a buzz cut, because he was playing a soldier. So you can kind of see where Anne Rice was coming from. Wasn't Tom Cruise supposed to be playing the same role in every film where, he's just going around blowing things up like a Team America puppet? Well, he certainly plays that kind of role better than anybody else, but in the 1990s he wanted to stretch himself as an actor. Interview with the Vampire would be his first chance to do that. Following on from Interview, he would make films like Eyes Wide Shut, in which he would show a very different side to himself and prove that he was far more versatile as an actor than people gave him credit for. However, even in his more gung-ho roles like Top Gun, there is something strangely vampiric about Tom Cruise. I mean, he's very charismatic and he's charming, but there's a coldness to that charisma and there's a coldness to that charm. So perhaps you could argue that Tom Cruise isn't playing closer to type when he's playing Pete Maverick Mitchell in Top Gun, but he is in fact playing closer to type when he plays the vampire Lestat. Also, Tom Cruise's Hollywood persona was definitively heterosexual, but there had been rumours about his sexuality for many years, none of them based on any solid evidence as far as I can tell, but just general rumours that he might have been gay. Also, there were questions about his heterosexual relationships. His marriage to Nicole Kidman provoked some controversy. People questioned whether or not it was a real relationship or whether it was purely for publicity reasons. Tom Cruise appeared on the cover of the October 1994 edition of Vanity Fair. The interview coincided with the release of the film. In that interview, Tom Cruise was asked about the gay rumours and issued a formal denial, and he insisted that his marriage to Nicole Kidman was very much a real relationship. Either way, the rumours would pursue him for many years to come. It was ironic that Tom Cruise was having to deny the gay rumours as he was promoting Interview with the Vampire, by far the gayest film he ever made. Check out this scene where Lestat kills Louis. I mean, the sexual tension is real. And let's not forget, 1994 was still very much the height of the AIDS crisis, and effective treatment for AIDS was still a few years away, and so the transfer of blood via the kiss of death had a much darker resonance in 1994. And this is something the New York Times had picked up on a couple of years before, when Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula was released in cinemas. Part of the reason the vampire myth endures through the centuries is because it can reflect very real fears about invasion and contamination that may be haunting a society at a given moment. Incidentally, both director Neil Jordan and producer David Geffen were keen to insist that the film shouldn't be seen as an allegory for the AIDS crisis. However, the unholy trinity at the heart of Interview with the Vampire of blood, sex, and death told a different story. Especially if you consider this scene right here, where Lestat feeds Louis his blood and turns him into a vampire. Clearly this scene would have resonated with cinema goers who were terrified about their own sex lives and the fear that the exchange of bodily fluids could lead to a death sentence for them. And on a much lighter note, the film also embraces the camp aspects of the story, including this scene right here where Lestat seduces a young guy and he's obviously going to kill him and drink his blood. He's hoping that Louis is going to do the same and seduce this lady he's picked up right here. But Louis, in the seduction process, just can't quite bring himself to kill her and drink her blood because, you know, he's conflicted and he's got a conscience. So as Louis is seducing her, he notices her little dog and decides, I think I'm going to kill the dog instead. So he does that and drinks the dog's blood. And as he's doing it, she starts screaming. Lestat realizes what's happening. He quickly runs over and kills her to stop her from screaming. And he has a massive go at Louis for being such a pussy. I mean, it's so ridiculous, but also really quite funny. I would actually argue that that scene deserves a place in the annals of high camp in the movies. It's underrated. It was widely reported at the time that Brad Pitt was miserable throughout the making of this film. He was conflicted about his character Louis. Well, I mean, Louis is a very conflicted vampire, but Brad Pitt was struggling to make it an interesting role because Louis is fundamentally passive. This may be a flaw in the script or a flaw in Anne Rice's story generally, because Louis begins as a conflicted vampire. He doesn't feel comfortable killing, but by the end of the film he remains, well, just as conflicted as he was at the start. But, you know, in a story, in a novel, in a film, isn't the hero supposed to go on a journey and discover something new at the end of it? Because Louis remained passive and conflicted throughout, all Brad Pitt could really do was mope around in front of the camera, looking miserable, while Tom Cruise was able to steal every scene he was in by being angry and fabulous and decadent and outrageous and a little bit evil and a little bit tender at times and sexy and, you know, all the things that Lestat gets to be. And as we established earlier, Tom Cruise was far and away the biggest star in 1994, so Brad Pitt was very much in a supporting role, and it was really his job to act as a kind of foil to Tom Cruise.
Brad Pitt was very successful as Louis because Brad Pitt hated the movie and hated everybody and didn't want to do it. As we hear, you know, but that translated as Louis' melancholy and angst about being a vampire. So if it works, you know.
Brad Pitt confirmed that he was very miserable during the making of this film in this 2011 interview with Entertainment Weekly. In that interview, he says that it was so bad by the time they were filming in London that he considered bailing, and he asked David Geffen how much it would cost to buy himself out of the contract. David Geffen said $40 million, and so Brad Pitt was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to finish this damn film then. Kirsten Dunst was cast as the vampire Claudia, and she gave a brilliant performance. Clearly, she went on to become a major movie star as an adult, but it was noted at the time that she stole many of the scenes that she was in with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. She was that damn good in this role. In the build-up to the film's release, there was a lot of controversy because Anne Rice had gone on record to say she did not want Tom Cruise in this film. So when he was promoting the film, inevitably, Tom Cruise was asked about the Anne Rice question, and he had this to say.
Okay, I mean, you're in place, Neil Jordan's in place, Brad Pitt's in place. There. And then the controversy starts. What was that all about? Because, I mean, Anne Rice, as far as one can gather, was deeply unhappy about it. And then she saw the film and she took out this full-page ad and said that she was virtually orgasmically happy now. But what was it all about in the first place?
You know, I think here's a woman who, the book was written at a time, she'd lost her daughter, I guess back in 1973 or 74, and to leukemia. And then she wrote this book, Interview with a Vampire, and I think that she so loved this story and these characters that, and she waited so long for it to get made that it meant a great deal to her. But she was definitely very unhappy with my casting. And, I can understand from her point of view, thinking that's not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Lestat. She was talking even physically, And the problem was I never had a chance to discuss with her what I was going to do in terms of, people don't understand what you do with acting and creating characters. You lose weight, you get the blonde hair, you get the contacts, and you work on the character and find that emotional foundation to allow that character to breathe.
A very gentlemanly response there from Tom Cruise, but later in that interview, he's asked if he had spoken to Anne Rice since the release of the film. He said they had had a civilized conversation. He was then asked if she had apologized to him, and he kind of paused for a second, and then he was like, no, she hasn't. But I guess, just the fact that she said she liked my performance in the film kind of was an apology. Inevitably, Anne Rice will be asked by interviewers why she had rejected Tom Cruise, and she had this to say on the eve of the film's release.
I got panic-stricken. When Tom Cruise was cast, I felt he was absolutely the wrong type for Lestat. I was terribly upset, and I had a listed phone number at the time. My phone was ringing off the hook with people who were upset with the casting. I was hardly the only one. There were letters coming in, people pouring in saying, how can Tom Cruise play Lestat? And of course, what I feel right now after seeing the movie 4 times is that Tom Cruise has done a fabulous job of playing Lestat. He's wonderful.
Interview with a Vampire was released on November 11, 1994. Why they didn't release it in time for Halloween, I do not know. It would have been the perfect Halloween movie. Anyhow, missed opportunity. Nonetheless, the film was a massive hit, and Anne Rice's novel finally made it to number 1 on the New York Times bestsellers list after an 18-year delay. Oprah Winfrey was gearing up to interview Tom Cruise. It was the 90s, the Oprah show was everything. She went to a screening of Interview with a Vampire and walked out after 10 minutes. She said she found the film too dark and too disturbing, so make of that what you will. Reviews were mixed but mostly positive, and I would say the film still stands up after 30 years. If you look at ratings on IMDb, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula has a 7.4 rating, and Interview with a Vampire has a 7.5. These films are often judged in comparison to each other. They were released within 2 years of each other, and they both redefined horror movies for the 90s, really. So I think it's interesting to see that the ratings are so close, but Interview with a Vampire just edges ahead slightly. Although some may fervently disagree, I think Coppola's Dracula film does look quite dated now, whereas Interview with the Vampire looks like it could have been made yesterday. So, in conclusion, what is the legacy of Interview with the Vampire, both the book and the film? Well, I would say it's huge. It went on to influence Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Twilight, and True Blood, and the film remains a touchstone in the history of Gothic cinema.